Time to get started. And as I told you Sunday, we'll start this evening with a bird's eye view of the book of Chronicles. Because if you'll recall, what we said was that there are really two biblical narratives, one that starts really as far back as Genesis. It doesn't mean it's all written by the same author. It surely wasn't. But all of the books from Genesis to the end of Kings really tell one storyline, except for Ruth that's inserted and Leviticus that's inserted at the time that those, approximate time that those stories actually took place. But then there's this second storyline that overlaps with the first, really goes all the way back to Genesis again, but just in terms of chronology or genealogies. And the storyline picks up with David in the book of First Chronicles at about chapter 9. It takes 8 chapters to go through all those genealogies, and then chapter 9 is really where the story takes off. But by mentioning all those names again, he's reminding us of everything that took place since Adam. He's reminding us of the lineage that will eventually result in David, and David will be the focal point of most of the Chronicles. David, Solomon, and then the lineage of David, who were all the kings of Judah. Now, I know I talked about a lot about history, and I know that variously appeals to different people. Some people really like that stuff, and some people really don't. It may have been confusing to you. Give you this chance if you have any questions held over from Sunday about the rationale for dividing the Bible into 2 storylines like this, or any of the things that we talked about on Sunday. Here's a chance for you to sound off, tell what you liked about it, didn't like about it, ask any questions you might have. I feel like there ought to be music playing now. Yes. Oh, thank you. I wasn't fishing for compliments, but thank you. Nobody had any questions. Either I really did a great job of explaining everything, or everybody's so thoroughly confused they don't know what to ask. Either way, we'll move on. All right, so from the last lesson, here are just a few things to remember. The genealogies of Chronicles end post-exile, as do the successive books in the same narrative, Ezra and Nehemiah. And the Jews believe that all 3 of those books were written by Ezra, who is identified in Ezra chapter 7 as a scribe. So it makes perfect sense. Chronicles focuses on Judah, David, and Solomon, but leaves out some major parts of the narrative. And tonight we're going to address why and what is accomplished by that in the books of Chronicles. Chronicles emphasizes the Davidic line, especially David and Solomon, the establishment of the Davidic throne, the establishment of the temple and worship practices, and God's continuing curation of Judah after Israel was vanquished. Think about that in historical context. Let's assume that it's true, as I've asserted, that this is all written post-exile. The people are coming back and being reestablished in the land. What purpose might it do? What purpose might it serve to establish those ideas in the minds of the people? Okay. We'll talk more about that later on, but I think that's true. It does give them a goal. Did we say David and Solomon? First Chronicles covers a span of 40 years. The entire book is about the reign of David, from the time that Saul died until the time that David died. So about 40 years. of David's reign. The entire book, 1 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles covers a span of 400 years, including Solomon and all the kings that came after him in Judah, all the way up to Zedekiah. The first 10 chapters, 40 years, again, the reign of Solomon. So all of 1 Chronicles and the first 10 chapters of the textual material in 2 Chronicles all cover David and Solomon. That's a lot of a focus to bring to two guys, right? 6 of those are about the temple, Solomon establishing the temple and temple practices and everything having to do with the temple. In chapter 7 and verse 1, the presence of God enters the temple. And what should this call to the mind of the reader? Think of another time where something very similar happened? Okay. All right. Moses and the tabernacle. In Exodus chapter 40, when the presence of God entered the tabernacle. Very similar kind of description. What would be the point there? Well, God was with Moses in the establishment of the tabernacle. This temple that had been destroyed and has now been rebuilt. Maybe it's just a poor image of the previous temple, but the presence of God enters that temple. And we can see that God is still with the people and he's still caring for them and that there's still some hope in Messiah. The last 27 chapters cover about then the balance, plus or 360 years, plus or minus. 27 chapters, 360 years. Okay. Remember, 1st and 2nd Kings cover the same span of material that's largely being covered in 27 chapters here. All right. Now, I just wanted to show you this. This is the death of David on that chart that I handed out on Sunday. And that marks the end of the book of 1 Chronicles. See how little of the material in Chronicles, how little of the time span of Chronicles is covered in the entire book of 1 Chronicles. Okay. So, 1 Chronicles establishes King David. And we're just going to do a flyby of the book. And that way, when the material comes up again in the context of going through the history, mainly focused on the kings, you'll remember perhaps the difference in the purpose of this book and the way it covers the material in comparison with the way it's covered in Kings. All right? So, 1 Chronicles establishes David's lineage from Adam through Abraham and through Judah. Why would that be important? Well, because all the messianic prophecies are fulfilled in David then, or he's a signpost along the way to the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies, and that would not be true if he had come from any other family. So this is very important to establish for the Jews who are returning back to the land, isn't it? They need to remember that God has made promises as far back as time immemorial, and those promises all centered around the coming of a king that would be eventually likened unto David. Okay, it clarifies him as the king after the passing of Saul and his household. You know what is the most disruptive in any country's history is the succession from one king to another. There's usually a battle that's fought. Sometimes there's a huge war that breaks out. All of the family members of one family have to be slaughtered in order to keep people from coming back and challenging the king for the throne. God took care of all that in one battle when Saul and all of his sons who were capable of fighting were killed. So there's no doubt left in our minds in Chronicles who's in charge and what that means as far as the future of the kingdom is concerned. David took and established Zion. He took it from the Jebusites. Remember, the Jebusites were still living there. David said, there's a nice prize waiting for anybody who takes it. So his mighty warriors went up and took that city, and it became then, instead of the city of the Jebusites, it became the city of David. Jerusalem, the city of peace. And around that city of peace, the Prince of Peace, like until Melchizedek, also a Prince of Peace, would be established on the throne of David. He had the support of his army in chapter 12. This is all established in 1 Chronicles, okay? He took the city that would eventually wear his name. He had the support of an entire army. He had a household with many children, which is very important for a king, especially if your descendants are supposed to reign on the throne. He defeated the Philistines in chapter 14, their long-standing enemy. They, how the Philistines had been a thorn in their side from the very beginning, the establishment of the nation, and David defeated them. He restored the ark to Jerusalem. So you can see he's beginning to muster all of the necessary elements to be firmly established as the king and type of a Messiah. He wrote psalms and prayed fervently. The Davidic covenant was reestablished in chapter 17. So Solomon's going to be reminded again when we get to 2 Chronicles of that Davidic covenant. He was a valiant and successful warrior. He was a righteous king. If you read the description of him in chapter 18, and the way he, at the end of that chapter, where he administered justice among the people, he had the respect of people for the way he ruled. He ruled the way a king should rule, and garnered God's favor because of it. He was a slayer of giants. He went back and killed those kinfolks of Goliath, the Anak, that had also been a threat to Israel. He repented earnestly over his unauthorized census. Did something that politicians rarely do, and that's to take full responsibility for having done it. Said, don't blame this on the people. Blame it, lay it at my feet. I'm the one who did it. And then he built an altar to God as a result of that. He fully provided for the temple. For the next 5 chapters, it'll tell all the provisions that David made for the temple. David wasn't going to be the one to build a temple, but you know what? He did everything else. He got the singers ready. He got the priests together. He made provisions for all the furniture out of his own treasuries. He provided for the furnishings of the tabernacle, the gold and the silver. All the groundwork was laid by the time Solomon came along. He put military and administration on solid footing before he died. Made it pretty easy for Solomon, I would think, to walk into that office and had his father, Solomon watched his father do all this and probably participated in it with him, since David had already told him he was going to be the heir to the throne. So he executed a clear plan of succession, very important in the continuation of any nation. And as you recall from the book of reading the book of Kings, and we will read from the book of Kings, that there was a challenge to the throne of Solomon, wasn't there? From one of Solomon's half-brothers. So this plan of succession, and the fact that David already established with his wife Bathsheba and with Solomon and with the people in his inner circle that Solomon would be the one to take over, was very important in the continuation. He advised Solomon on succession in chapter 28. His last official acts were offerings for the temple and prayer in the assembly. So establishing David again as a spiritual leader of the people, even to his final acts. But Chronicles leaves out many of David's failings. As I mentioned on Sunday, his scandalous relationship that resulted in murder that's recorded in 2 Samuel, Chronicles doesn't mention it. His homicidal and wanton children. See the stories about Absalom and what happened to Tamar at the hand of her brother Amnon. He fled from powerful adversaries like Saul and Absalom. Those are recorded in Samuel, not so much we're not even spoken of in Chronicles, passed over. Why? Doesn't seem to fit what the chronicler was trying to do. I've read some commentary about this, and it's a little comical what all kinds of suggestions you can get from commentaries, and you can tell a child could come up with some of the ideas that these commentators can come up with. And I know that there are some that are really good, and there are a lot of these people who should be highly respected. But it just leaves you wondering sometimes, the suggestion that somehow the chronicler was trying to clean up the reputation of David and Solomon by leaving out those details. If the book of Kings, books of Samuel and Kings were already in existence at the time the Chronicles was written, and those people were familiar with those texts, what good would it do to try to clean up the image of David? Come on. Really? No, the likelihood is the chronicler has something else in mind. And again, I want us to think together about what that might be as we get on toward the end of the lesson here. Okay, so now we're establishing King Solomon. First recorded public acts are sacrifices and prayer. So he's kind of taken up where his father left off, right? His last public acts of David were sacrifices and prayer. And the first public acts of Solomon are sacrifices and prayer. Solomon is establishing himself as a spiritual leader for the people, just like his father David was. And he's off to a great start. In chapter 1, God responds to Solomon's offerings and to his prayer with both wisdom and riches. And then Solomon oversees the building and dedication of the temple. So again, picking up right where David left off, there's some evident attempt on the part of the writer to establish continuity between David and Solomon, establishing the kingdom of Solomon in the cookie-cutter mold of his father. And then in chapter 7, as we already said, the glory of God enters the temple, showing God's approval of the things that have gone on up to this point in time. I've seen some people try to blame David for some of the temple worship practices. Listen, if David was at fault for anything that he did in the temple, it certainly isn't clear by what God did next. He came and filled the temple with his glory and sent down fire from heaven to burn the sacrifice. God loved everything that David did and everything that Solomon did in the establishment of that temple. The Davidic covenant was renewed in chapter 7 with Solomon. And he lays it out in Deuteronomy type fashion. If you do well, these are the things I'm going to do for you. I'm going to establish your throne forever. Not one child of yours will fail from the throne forever. If you do poorly, the people are going to be wiped off the face of the land. And so we begin to set up the scenario for the fall of Jerusalem that we'll see by the end of the book. Solomon's accomplishments, wisdom and wealth, are focused on in chapters 8 and 9. Again, showing that God is with him and keeping his promises and showing favor yet to his father. And he leaves out some of Solomon's great failings. There's nothing said in Chronicles about his hundreds of wives. 700 wives and 300 porcupines. There's nothing said about the adversaries the Lord raised against him, as in the book of Kings. Doesn't say anything about his idolatry in later years, just makes a passing, almost indirect reference to it at one point. And then when it comes time for Solomon to die, we have the establishment of Solomon's son on the throne. So again, there's a lot of emphasis being placed on this idea of succession. Rehoboam was the heir apparent and actually is the one who succeeded him in chapter 9. It talks about Rehoboam's error in judgment and the rise of Jeroboam, giving rise to the division of the kingdom, but almost just mentions it as a historical side note and then continues on with the picture of Rehoboam and Judah, largely ignoring Israel, except as it has a direct bearing on the history of Judah. He secures the house of Judah in chapter 11, Rehoboam does. He rebuilds the great fortified cities in chapter 11, the cities of Judah. Again, ignoring the cities of Israel, whatever might be happening to them by this time. The Assyrians have already taken that over. He spends his time talking about the cities in Judah. He consolidates the worship at Jerusalem. Okay, so maybe that had begun to falter some. We know that it did by the end of Solomon's days because of the multiple temples to idolatrous gods that had been set up throughout the land. And Rehoboam seems to be reconsolidating all that worship in the holy city. He establishes his own royal household in the same way we saw that David established a household and Solomon established a household. Now Rehoboam's establishing a household. There's a plundering of Jerusalem and the temple by Egypt that is attributed to Rehoboam's unfaithfulness. So the bad things that happened in Judah, the writer does focus on those, and he calls our attention to them, but he also goes to great lengths to explain why those things happened. He doesn't just say, and Jerusalem was plundered by Egypt. He said it was because of the failings of Rehoboam and his tendency toward idolatry that these things happen. So he goes into a little commentary and explains why, in every case where something happens to Judah, how it's always because of a moral failing of the king or of the people at large. And in this case, I think it was both. Chapter 12. And then the Davidic line to Hezekiah entirely is in chapters 13 through 29. So it really just traces the Davidic line, king by king. Not a lot of emphasis is given on each king, but the emphasis is that these are all part of the same dynasty. They're all part of the heritage of David. And then maintaining the Davidic line involved Hezekiah's reforms. Things had gotten out of hand by the time Hezekiah came along, and so Hezekiah does what? He restores the temple. He restores temple worship. He restores the Passover. He restores the priesthood, reestablishing the religion, and that's what makes Hezekiah such a great leader and worthy of the number of chapters that cover his life, making him a lot like David and Solomon in this text. And then God preserves Jerusalem from Assyria because Hezekiah listened to him. So we have reasons why Jerusalem is overcome, because the leaders don't listen to him. The people are turning to idolatry. We have reasons why Jerusalem is successful, and it has to do with the obedience of the king and the people. And the Davidic line then during the decline of Judah and Jerusalem in chapters 33 to 36. A short bit of text, covers a long span of time, but the time from Hezekiah, Josiah is mentioned in there, again as a great reformer, so more attention is given to him than to the others. But we're headed toward decline and eventual destruction, because by the time we get to chapter 36, things have just come completely undone under the last few kings since Hezekiah and Josiah, to where the people are absolutely steeped in idolatry. And so ending the Chronicles, we'll read in those last few that last chapter, actually, chapter 36, about Judah's hardness of heart, the razing of Jerusalem and the exile, and the decree of Cyrus. the decree of Cyrus that brought them back into the land from exile. So the period of exile, as we said on Sunday, the period of exile is going to be more or less ignored. He recognizes as part of the writing that it happened. He talks about them having been taken into exile, those who survived, but nevertheless, that's not the important part of the story. The important part of this story to the chronicler is that Cyrus sent them back. How often does that happen in history? How many times have you ever heard of a people being taken off into captivity and then money being given to them by the government that took them to reestablish them in their own territory? How often have you ever heard of that in history? Who would ever have thought that possible? But God said through the prophets that it would happen. He said there was still hope in Messiah. And this is the one case in history that we can cite where it actually did happen. Okay, so let's look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and read verses 11 through 16. Anybody have a question about what we've talked about up till now?
The 700 wives, was that part of population to populate the earth? Did he have children with those 70 dear children, those 700 wives?
The question he asked was the 700 wives. Was that an attempt on Solomon's part to populate the earth in keeping with the commandment by God from the beginning, right? To be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. The best explanation that I've seen for that, Ivan, is that during this time, the way that kings created alliances with other kingdoms was to marry their wives, to marry the daughters of the kings of other countries. And there are actually quite a few examples of this in Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern history, where in order to establish trade relations and normalize relationships with a country perhaps that you've been to war with, marry the king's daughter. And I mean, how can you go kill a king who has married your daughter, right? Well, you know, along with that comes part of that country's culture, and that's part of the deal. If you marry somebody's daughter, yeah, they're going to affect your culture. And that's what you want to have happen. You want that country's culture to be affected by your daughter's presence. So the daughter's then going to have demands. When she marries the king, she's going to want a palace of her own. It certainly won't be like the king's palace, but it'll be nice. Be nice digs. And she's going to want temples established to her gods. Now, if you're Solomon and you've got these trade relations and you've got a wife who's demanding a temple to her gods, what are you going to do? And Solomon succumbed to that, and he actually did build temples to the gods of all these women. And then those women said, honey, why don't you go to the temple with me and bow down and worship today and burn a little incense with me? And what does Solomon say? No, I can't do that. I'm going to tell my daddy. Okay, you kind of get the idea that these alliances come with heavy baggage. And Solomon weighed himself down with heavy baggage. 700 wives. Can you even imagine such a thing? And then concubines, which are really in the Jewish tradition, they're lesser wives. So it's not that they're not wives, it's not that they don't have any rights. They have some. They are wives, but they're wives of a lower status. So a king might marry a woman, for example, whose family had been killed and she was left destitute on her own as a show of kindness to her family, or as a gesture of the king's great beneficence, right? He wants to show everybody in the land what a generous ruler he is. So he takes the poor women of Judah into his own house and let them eat at his table and dresses them in fine clothing and takes care of them. That's a show to the people of what a wonderful guy I am. But of course that comes with some baggage too, doesn't it? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah.
So you're saying that they were for life also?
Yes. Yes. If you go back as far as Genesis to the story of Jacob and his 4 wives, we say, 2 of those were wives and 2 of those were maidservants, and they're referred to as concubines in some places and in wives as others. So that's just one example of how people can, that a woman would have been both. Now, concubine nowadays, by definition from a dictionary, can mean anything. A concubine can be just somebody you're living with, according to modern definitions. In different languages and different cultures, the word can mean different things. But in the Hebrew mind, concubine was a wife of a lesser status. She had fewer rights than a wife of full status. Deborah? Oh, okay, great. All right, so where is that found? 1:9, okay. Okay, so it does sort of sound like Solomon saw that as having been fulfilled in the days of his forefathers. Very good. All right, 2 Chronicles 36, 11 through 16. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. Okay, now Zedekiah is that last king. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. So Jeremiah made prophecies to him. He more or less thumbed his nose at Jeremiah, and the Lord took notice of that. It was counted towards as his arrogance. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who made him swear by God. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel. Okay, so we're explaining now why Israel was taken into captivity. And remember, I said it's always going to be the fault of the king and the people. And there it is. All of the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations, and they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. What do you suppose that means, polluted the house of the Lord?
They brought in idols.
Okay. All right. Some of those practices that were established probably by Solomon and some of his wives, why don't you put my God next to your God? In doing so, the temple is polluted. All right? The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people. So these people weren't just not doing what God said. They were scoffing against what God had said. They were denigrating the prophets who were speaking the words, and they were making fun of them and dismissing them from their presence and hardening their hearts against them, and until there was no remedy. So that's where we find ourselves. When God finally brings the axe down on them, you might think, what a cruel way to deal with his people. Well, think of what all God put up with for these 400 years before the axe fell, telling them, begging them, imploring them to come back to him. And when it got to the point where the people were impenitent and there was no more remedy, that's when it happened. The destruction, the exile. Nebuchadnezzar came from Babylon. All were killed and taken captive without mercy on young and old alike. It says old men, no regard to young maidens or young men. The temple and palace was plundered and burned. Survivors, those who did survive, were taken as servants. And such was Daniel. Why? To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. What happens when you disregard the Sabbath? It's your first step down a long path of destruction. And what happens when you're destroyed? The land will enjoy its Sabbaths. It's kind of a poetic justice to all this, God is saying. Jeremiah is the one who warned you, and now Jeremiah's word is being upheld, and now the land will have its rest. All the days that it laid desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. That's a nice number, isn't it? 70 years. The Jews' favorite number of 7 until the time was complete, and times 10 to emphasize it. The land is going to have its 10 Sabbaths. What is this narrative really about and why? Now, this is the moment I told you about. I told you what kept telling you was coming as we went through the class. What's this about and why? What's it really about? Rebuild, okay? As they will in Ezra and Nehemiah, which I've been arguing is part of this same narrative. In fact, we've gotten to the end of Chronicles now, and I showed you how 2 Chronicles is connected, organically connected to Ezra through the actual text. The last verse of 2 Chronicles is identical to the first verse of Ezra. And Ezra takes up mid-sentence where Chronicles leaves off. Okay? So this is all part of a rebuilding story. I'm convinced of that. What else do you think?
Part of it is there's a prophecy that they're going to have another king like David, who they think is going to rebuild Israel.
Okay, excellent. Promises have been made about a Messiah that's coming. What if we got back to the land and we forgot our history and we forgot about the promises that had been made about this Messiah? So this would be a nice reminder, wouldn't it? Take people back through the history that they have maybe forgotten or have swept away to the back of their mind as they spent 70 years. They've been away from their homeland for 70 years. There probably weren't many people who were alive at the time that Jerusalem was sacked who were still alive at the time they came back into the land. So they've had at least a generation, maybe 2, to forget everything that they knew from the promises of the Old Testament and from the histories of kings. So maybe we need a reminder that these promises were made and that they were established in David, and that David is going to be the focal point of the kingdom moving forward, even though we're generations removed away from David. Okay, what else? Okay, so it might be a message to the people to whom this was written. Look, don't go down that path again, right? Yeah, sure. What else? All right. Imagine being displaced from your motherland for 2 generations and then returned to live in it permanently. What would you need to know, or what would you need to refresh? I can't help but think of Josh and Chase and their families going to China, and they only spent 2 years over there. But already by the time they came back, they were concerned about the parts of the United States that their children might be missing out on, that they might be forgetting because they grew up in a foreign country. I know they were concerned about that. 2 years. Imagine 70. So what would you want to do when you brought your family back to their homeland after 2 generations? Wouldn't you want to remind them of the essential points of their history that led you to where you're at and give you a sense of trajectory so you kind of have a sense of where you're going? I think they would. I think they would want them to know the heritage of the land that they are coming back to. So he is reestablishing the heritage, and it's a proud heritage that he establishes for them. And I think that may be why he focuses so much on the household of David and the household of Solomon and establishing them through this kingdom and recalling their history all the way back as far as Adam. He wants them to have that firmly in their mind as they're reestablished in the land. Add a messianic layer, as Steve mentioned, to that. Not only does he want them to understand their history and their heritage, he also wants to understand they're special. And it's God who makes them special. And that they have a special mission to carry out in their lifetime. Messiah will come someday. And in order to bring about a welcoming place for Messiah, we need to behave in a certain kind of way. The nations around us need to recognize us as a kind of people. They failed in that mission. And when Jesus came, what did he say? You are the light of the world. I think Jesus is chiding them a bit. I think he's saying, this is what you were supposed to have been. I think in the Beatitudes, when Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That again, he's saying, my people are supposed to be different. But look at Israel in the day that Jesus came. How different were they really in terms of the things that mattered from the nations around them? You're the salt of the earth. You're supposed to rely on God, and yet you're chasing after all the same things the Gentiles chase after. So when the people came back to the land after having been in exile for all those years, they are to remember that they're part of an ongoing story that has an endpoint farther down the road. They're participants in that story. But if they don't know the storyline up to where they got to, how are they going to know how to carry that forward into the next generations? Until Messiah should reestablish himself on the throne of David. You need to know that you're the children of David and Solomon and Rehoboam and all those who came after him, all the way to Hezekiah and finally to Zedekiah. Don't make the same mistakes that those people made. Make a suitable environment for the Messiah to come, because we still have hope. Chronicles and the subsequent narrative of Ezra and Nehemiah lays out the case for the legitimacy of Judah and the returned exiles as a proxy for all the children of Abraham, the remnant of Jacob, and to show that the presence of God and that the messianic hope remain with them. That's a worthwhile goal for those three books. And I don't want us to forget that while we're studying the mundane details of the history of this time period, that when we see a passage from Chronicles thrown in there, that it's just part of the mundane details. No, there's a larger story going on here, and we're extracting a text from it so that we can tell a fuller story from the book of Kings. But let's not forget what the purpose of the story of Chronicles is. It's a marvelous story, and it's a really important one in the history of the Jews. It's not the same as 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. It's very different, and it's different for a very good reason. It was written at a different time in history and for a different purpose. We're going to reestablish the people of God now that they've been restored from their captivity after all this time. How are we doing for time? All right, we're just about done here. And that's good because I just ran out of slides. What questions do you have? Comments? Yeah, Carrie said that the personal failings of David and Solomon are lessons to be learned, but they're not lessons to be learned here. I think that's a really good way to put that. That's not the point we're trying to make in Chronicles. There you go. Listen, we've got 4 teachers in this class this time, and that's for the reason of giving some of the young guys the opportunity to teach. And so Ben Wright and Sam Logan are going to teach several of the classes, and we're welcoming them and glad that they're here, and we want to give them our full support. And this is a great class for giving that support. So please do that. And starting next week, then we'll start our stepwise history through the books of Kings and Chronicles combined. And we may do some violence to the book of Chronicles, but don't forget the lesson that it's supposed to teach. Thank you.